You chop onions like you're cooking for that little roadside diner of yours, Adeline. Never mind, just worry about the floor. Nobody can fault you on floors. The words landed in the 2-Michelin-star kitchen of Maison Lorraine at 11 o'clock at night, and the 27-year-old woman kneeling beneath the sink simply rose to her feet, her hands still wrinkled with water from the 1000th dish shift of her life. Addie Vaughn answered very quietly. Every ingredient has a voice of its own, chef. You just have to be willing to listen. Priscilla Hale laughed and dumped an entire basket of onions into the sink. A dishwasher with a philosophy. You're paid to scrub, not to listen. Nobody in that kitchen knew Addie had once been 3 weeks away from Paris, and nobody ever asked why her left hand could no longer hold a knife steady. They only knew her as the night girl, the last one to turn off the lights, the only one with a key to the back door. Until the morning, a man walked into the restaurant, and the entire kitchen fell silent, as though someone had closed a hand around its throat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten anyone. He simply sat down on the steel counter, a chipped cast-iron pot with a burnt black bottom, and a single handwritten page, the ink long since blurred. "This is the 5th place," said the man beside him. The first 4 all said they could do it. Not one of them could. 6 weeks later, the dish cooked in that pot would bring $1 million wedding to its feet in the middle of the reception, and someone in this kitchen would lose everything because of it. What no one saw coming was this. Beneath the burnt black at the bottom of that pot, 2 letters were carved, and only the dishwasher ever saw them. If you believe kindness is never truly forgotten, leave a like on today's story. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to walk with us through the stories still waiting ahead. The door had barely closed behind the man when the kitchen finally dared to breathe again. Priscilla Hale walked over to the steel table, lifted the cast-iron pot with 2 fingers, as though she were holding something freshly pulled from a sewer, and slowly turned it before the entire staff. "Take a good look," she said. "This is what a restaurant with 2 Michelin stars is about to spend 6 weeks serving. A poor person's pot. 30 years ago, it sat in the kitchen of some apartment building, and now it's sitting on my table." No one laughed. No one dared not to laugh. She set it down on the steel surface with a dry, hard clack. "My broth is strained 3 times. I order my beef from Kagoshima. And yet someone brings this here and tells me to recreate a stew made with shoulder meat and potatoes. Can I do it? Of course I can. But I'll do it my way, and when it reaches the plate, it'll be worthy of the name hanging outside that door." Eleanor Whitfield stood in the doorway leading up to the office, one hand resting on the railing, listening from beginning to end. She said only one sentence, and it cut through everything. 42 days, Priscilla. Miss Castellani's wedding will take place exactly 42 days from this morning. I don't care how you do it. I care about the look on that family's faces when they walk out of this restaurant. Priscilla turned around, her voice instantly sweetening. "You have nothing to worry about." Eleanor looked at her for one more second, then down at the pot, and then she went upstairs. For the rest of that evening's shift, no one mentioned the pot again. It sat at the corner of the steel table among the cutting boards and trays of ice, and every time someone passed, they pushed it a little farther aside, until it rested against the very edge like something waiting to be thrown away. Addie Vaughn saw it happen. She said nothing. She finished chopping the 4th basket of onions, stacked the trays, wiped down the table, and retreated to her dishwashing station, where she'd stood for 3 years, and where no one ever stepped, unless they had something dirty to hand her. At 11:30 that night, when most of the kitchen lights had been switched off, and only the row of yellow lamps above the washing area remained, Priscilla passed by carrying the final stack of pots and pans. She dropped all of them into the sink at once. The crash of metal rang against the ceiling. Then, on top of the pile, she dropped the cast-iron pot. "Finish these before you leave," she said without looking back. "The pot, too. I want it clean by tomorrow morning. Mr. Castellani pays us to cook, not to preserve his memories for him." Addie heard the back door close. Then she heard the last kitchen assistant's car start in the alley. Then there was silence. She rolled up her sleeves, turned on the hot water, and began. Copper pots first, cast-iron pans next, baking trays last. By 1 o'clock in the morning, only the pot remained. She lifted it, and knew at once that it was heavier than anything she'd ever held in that kitchen, not because of the iron, but because of the thick layer of burned residue sealed across the bottom, hard as stone, black as coal. One layer pressed over another through more years than anyone could count. She filled it with hot water and let it soak. She scrubbed. When the water cooled, she changed it, then she scrubbed again. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the black crust finally began to break loose in pieces no larger than a fingertip, and every piece that came away revealed another layer beneath it. Her left hand began to tremble. Her little finger would no longer straighten, so she switched to her right hand, clamped the rim of the pot between her knees to keep it from slipping, and kept scrubbing. At 2:45, a patch of gray iron finally appeared at the bottom of the pot, and on that patch were 2 marks. Addie stopped. She tilted the pot toward the light. They weren't scratches. They weren't cracks. They were 2 letters carved with the point of a knife. Short strokes, deep strokes. The work of someone who'd had to press over the same lines again and again before they cut into the iron. An R, beside it, separated by a small space, a J. Between the 2 letters was a short horizontal mark, as though whoever had carved them wanted to say that these 2 names belonged together. She sat down on the floor with her back against the cabinet, the pot resting in her lap, and stared at those 2 letters for a very long time. She'd scrubbed thousands of pots in her life. Not one of them had ever carried a name. At 6 o'clock the next morning, when Priscilla had barely hung her coat on the hook, Addie was already waiting with the pot in her hands. "Chef, I've finished cleaning it, but there's something I think you should know." She turned the pot upside down. "There are letters carved into the bottom. 2 initials. I think they're the names of 2 children, and I think the person who carved them was the child of the man who owns this pot." Priscilla looked down for exactly 1 second. "No longer. Dirt," she said. "Keep scrubbing. They're carved into the iron, ma'am. Scrubbing won't remove them. Then polish them until they fade." Addie continued, holding the pot upside down. "This is why they brought the pot here." Priscilla turned fully toward her, and when she spoke, her voice was no louder than ordinary conversation. That was what made the entire kitchen behind them fall silent. "Adeline, you're paid to scrub, not to read. Put it on the table and go do your job." Addie set the pot down on the steel table. She took 2 steps, then stopped. She turned back, pulled her phone from the pocket of her apron, tilted the pot toward the window where the morning light was beginning to rise, and took a photograph. Just one. Then she slipped the phone back into her pocket, retied the strings of her apron, and walked toward her sink. The nurse on duty on the 3rd floor called her back the moment she stepped into the hallway. "Miss Vaughn, I have something for you. I was going to mail it, but I thought it would be better to give it to you in person." She held out a white envelope, its edges slightly curled from sitting in a drawer for several days. "Read it before you go into his room. Read it first, then go in." Addie opened it right there. It was a letter from the financial office, printed in perfectly even type that didn't carry the slightest trace of a human voice. An overdue balance of $8,400, 30 days from the date written on the letter. If the amount wasn't paid by the deadline, patient Owen Vaughn would be transferred to a county-operated public care facility 90 minutes away from the current center. Addie read it a second time, then a third. The words didn't change. "I'm sorry," the nurse said softly. "I kept his file on my desk for as long as I could, but it's gone upstairs now, and up there, all they see are numbers. I understand. 90 minutes each way, Miss Vaughn. You work nights. You won't be able to visit him anymore." "I know." The nurse was silent for a moment, then asked the question she'd asked Addie many times over the past 3 years, and every time she asked it with the voice of someone who still hoped the answer might somehow be different. "You still haven't been able to reach any other family, Addie?" "There isn't anyone else." She folded the letter, slipped it into the pocket of her apron, and pushed open the door. Owen was lying on his side facing the window, 24 years old, thin, his hair longer than the last time she'd visited. The breathing tube rested beside his pillow, and the machine at the head of the bed kept up its steady rhythm. He heard the door and shifted his eyes toward it, and when he saw his sister, one corner of his mouth managed to lift just a little. Addie pulled the chair close to the bed, sat down, and took his hand. "I'm late. Yesterday's shift ran until 3 o'clock in the morning." She said it as though it were something amusing. "But let me tell you about this. Yesterday, a man came to the restaurant. I've never seen anyone walk into that kitchen and make the whole room go silent like that. No one had to tell anyone. Mrs. Hale was in the middle of shouting at people, and even she stopped. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten anyone. He just set an old cast-iron pot and a handwritten recipe on the table." Owen blinked. Addie understood that blink. For 3 years, She'd learned how to read it. Yes, cast iron. The kind Mom used to use, only much older, with the bottom burned completely black. He wants the restaurant to recreate one of his mother's dishes for his sister's wedding. Mrs. Hale said it was poor people's food and didn't belong on the menu. She said that in front of 20 people. Addie gave a quiet laugh. Then at the end of the shift, she threw the pot into my sink. She took out her phone, opened the photograph she'd taken that morning, and turned the screen toward him. I scrubbed it for almost 4 hours. The burned layer was hard as stone and came off in pieces. Just before 3 o'clock in the morning, I found this. She moved the screen closer. Look carefully. An R, then a J. There's a little line connecting the two letters. It isn't a scratch. Someone carved them with the tip of a knife, pressing over the same marks again and again until they cut into the iron. She held the screen there a little longer so he could see. I've scrubbed more pots than I can count in my life, Owen. Not one of them ever had a name. Owen stared at the picture for a long time, then shifted his eyes toward the ceiling, then back to his sister. Addie nodded. Yes, that's what I thought too. 2 children. Probably a brother and sister fighting over who got to scrape the pot clean, then carving their names into the bottom so they wouldn't have to argue anymore. And their mother let them do it without scolding them once because she thought it was funny. She set the phone on the edge of the bed. I told Mrs. Hale. I said this is why they brought the pot here. Do you know what she said to me? She said I was paid to scrub, not to read. Addie fell silent for a moment. I took the picture before I left. I don't know what for. I just felt that if no one saved it, it would disappear. A cart rolled past in the hallway. Owen breathed. The machine counted each rhythm, and the afternoon light slowly changed color across the opposite wall. Addie sat quietly, her thumb gently stroking the back of his hand, and she said nothing about the letter in her apron pocket. She'd meant to tell him. She'd already arranged the words in her mind, something soft and brief, something like, "There's a little paperwork problem. I'm taking care of it. Everything will be fine." But then she looked down at his face and understood that if she spoke, her brother would spend the next 30 days lying there counting. So she kept talking about the kitchen, about the Italian man at the produce counter who always hid the biggest onion for her, about the stray cat behind the delivery door, about how Chicago had turned cold earlier than usual that week. She stayed until the nurse knocked on the door for the second time. When Addie reached the doorway, she turned back once more. "I'll come Thursday, just like always." Owen blinked twice. She walked home, and it wasn't until she reached the restaurant's employee changing room that she finally took the letter out of her apron pocket. She stood before the row of old metal lockers beneath the only light still burning there, turned the envelope over, and wrote on the back with a ballpoint pen in large, clear letters, writing for herself and no one else. 8,400. 30 days. She stared at those numbers for a while as though they belonged to a stranger. Then she opened locker number 22, placed the envelope in the lowest compartment beside her spare shoes and the worn sweater she kept there, closed the door, and secured the combination lock. She didn't know that in the entire kitchen, that lock was the only thing she still trusted, and it would be the first thing to betray her. On Tuesday morning, Priscilla Hale taped Mr. Castellani's handwritten recipe to the whiteboard with 2 strips of tape, stepped back, and studied it as though she were examining an apprentice's drawing. Then she picked up a marker and circled nearly everything written on the page. Remove the shoulder meat and replace it with beef cheeks braised in red wine. Remove the potatoes and replace them with mashed potatoes passed through a sieve 3 times. She capped the marker. People don't pay $160 a plate to eat potatoes, ladies and gentlemen. They pay to eat their memories prepared by someone who knows how to cook better than their mother did. The entire kitchen nodded. For the next 3 weeks, the kitchen moved to a rhythm whose every detail Addie could see clearly from the dishwashing station, because the dishwasher was the only person in the kitchen who had time to watch. She noticed the small silver digital scale Mrs. Hale always kept beside her right hand near the cutting board, and she noticed that the chef used it for everything. Not only when she baked, and not only when she measured flour. She weighed salt. She poured salt into a tiny bowl, placed it on the scale, and brushed away a little at a time with the tip of her finger until the number on the display settled exactly where she wanted it. Only then did she empty it into the pot. 3 grams for the morning stock, 7 grams when more water was added. In her 22 years as a chef, perhaps no one had ever asked why the head of a restaurant with 2 Michelin stars needed to weigh salt like a pharmacist, because in that kitchen, no one asked Mrs. Hail anything. Addie noticed something else too. Mrs. Hale handled spoons constantly. She stirred, scooped, tilted the spoon so the broth ran down in a thin stream to test its thickness, raised it to eye level, and examined its color beneath the lights. She did all of it beautifully, exactly as it might appear in a book. But the spoon never rose higher than her chin. Not once. 3 weeks, hundreds of spoons, and Addie never saw the metal touch her lips. Then there was the third thing, the thing everyone else in the kitchen dismissed as the habit of a demanding woman. Whenever she finished seasoning, Mrs. Hale always called over one of the line cooks, handed him the spoon, and asked the same 2 words, "Good now?" The cook tasted it, nodded, and said, "Yes, chef, perfect." Then Mrs. Hale nodded as well, turned away, and the stock was moved to the warming burner. Once, and only once, a new cook tasted it and hesitantly said that it seemed a little bland. "Chef." Mrs. Hale looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she picked up the bowl of salt, placed it on the scale, brushed in exactly a little more, emptied it into the pot, and handed the spoon back to him. "Good now?" He said yes. From that day forward, he never said seemed again. Addie stood at the sink with both hands submerged in water, storing every one of those details somewhere in her mind without yet knowing why, just as she had kept the photograph of the pot's bottom on her phone. On the 19th day, when the 4th test version of the stew was placed on the steel table for the whole kitchen to see, the dish rested on the white plate like a polished jewel. The meat had been arranged in 3 thin layers. A streak of sauce ran across the plate. 3 tiny drops of green oil sat in a perfectly even line, and a single young leaf had been placed on top with tweezers. Mrs. Hale stepped back half a pace, satisfied. "This is something we can place in front of the Castellani family." And Addie, who stood 4 steps away wiping her hands on her apron, spoke. She didn't speak loudly. She used the same voice she always used when answering anyone in that kitchen. But the room was silent, so everyone heard her. "Chef, there are 14 ingredients on that page, and 12 of them are the cheapest things in the market. If you remove everything inexpensive from that recipe, then it isn't his mother's dish anymore. It's only another dish carrying the same name." No one moved. Priscilla Hale didn't turn around immediately. She placed the tweezers on the tray, adjusted the young leaf a little more, and only then turned to face her. "Miss Vaughn, you've stood at that sink for 3 years, and in all those 3 years, I've never asked you a single question about food. Do you know why?" Addie didn't answer. Because in a kitchen, people speak about the place where they stand. Dishwashers speak about soap. Chefs speak about food. The day you can stand where I'm standing, you may say what you just said, and I'll listen. She picked up the plate and handed it to a cook to carry away. "But today, you're finished speaking. Go back to your station." Addie went back to her station. 3 hours later, when the evening shift was halfway through and Mrs. Hale had gone upstairs to sign paperwork, Marisol, the youngest cook in the kitchen, passed the washing area, stopped, pretended to rearrange a stack of trays, and spoke very softly without looking at Addie. "Addie, I'm going to tell you something, and then I'm leaving right away." Addie didn't look up. "All right, don't let her see you tasting the stock. I saw you dip your finger into the pot this afternoon. You aren't allowed to touch that pot, and you aren't allowed to taste anything in this kitchen. It's written in your night shift contract. Read it again." Marisol stacked one more tray. "2 years ago, there was a man who worked nights like you. He tasted something once. Just once." She didn't yell. She only wrote a piece of paper, and he was gone the next day. Then the girl walked away. Addie remained alone beside the running faucet, staring toward the steaming pot of stock at the far end of the kitchen, the pot she could reach in only 12 steps. And she understood that for 3 years she'd been living inside a kitchen with rules, and those rules hadn't been written to protect the food. Before leaving, Mrs. Hale stopped at the door and pointed toward the cardboard box beneath the steel table, the box the Castellani family had sent with the pot on the first day, and that no one had bothered to open since. "Throw that away. It's full of rags and old things, and it's been sitting under the table for a month. It's unsanitary. Take it out with the trash tonight. I don't want to see it here tomorrow morning." Then she left. At 1 o'clock in the morning, when every light in the kitchen had been turned off except the row above the washing station, Addie pulled the box out from beneath the table. It was heavier than she expected. She dragged it across the floor, down the rear hallway, and over to the door leading into the alley, where 3 large trash bins stood against the wall. She lifted the lid of one bin, turned back to pick up the cardboard box, and only when she tilted it did she hear something solid slide inside. She set the box down. She crouched, opened the flaps, and began removing the contents one layer at a time. On top were rags, exactly as Mrs. Hale had said. Faded squares of cotton folded neatly, the kind people cut from old shirts. Beneath the rags was a wooden spoon with a broken handle, only half of it remaining. Beneath that was a woolen potholder, scorched at one corner, and at the very bottom, resting on its side in one corner of the box, was a small ceramic jar, no larger than a fist, earthen brown, with a wooden lid and a rubber ring that had already begun to rot. Addie picked it up. It was heavy. It was cold, and it made no sound when she shook it, because whatever was inside had hardened into a single, solid mass. She twisted the lid. It didn't move. She wedged the jar between her knees, turned it with her right hand, and after 3 attempts, the lid came loose with a dry pop. She raised it to her nose, and then she sat perfectly still. Inside that jar was a scent she'd never encountered in 3 years inside this kitchen. It wasn't the scent of anything listed in the spice inventory at Maison Lorraine. It wasn't star anise, cinnamon, bay leaf, or pepper. Beneath everything was a warm, sweet layer. Above it was a dry, sharp heat. And between those two was something third, something faintly burned, faintly bitter, the kind of smell that would make someone in a kitchen say that something had been scorched. She smelled it a second time, then a third. She closed her eyes and searched through every drawer of her memory, through 3 years of culinary school, through 2 years spent working in her parents' diner, through everything she'd ever learned and everything she'd ever smelled, and she couldn't find a name for that third thing. She put the lid back on. She looked at the open trash bin one step away, the bin that would be emptied by the garbage truck in the morning if she dropped the ceramic jar inside, ending the matter here and sparing her from having to explain anything to anyone. Then she looked at the cardboard box. Someone in the Castellani household had wrapped this jar, placed it at the bottom of the box, and arranged rags over it to keep it from breaking before bringing it here with the pot. People didn't use rags to protect something they intended to throw away. Addie stood, closed the lid of the trash bin, and slipped the ceramic jar into the pocket of her apron. She also picked up the broken wooden spoon and the scorched potholder, placed all 3 objects on a clean tray, and only then carried the empty cardboard box into the alley. "People throw away what they don't understand," she said, speaking to no one. On her way back inside, she passed the hallway leading to the records room, the small room at the end of the corridor where she had to mop the floor and vacuum the metal shelves once each week. A room holding 20 years of paperwork from a restaurant that had passed through 3 generations. Only one hallway light remained on. The records room door stood slightly ajar, and inside, on the table against the wall, lay a stack of open folders that Mrs. Whitfield had pulled out the day before to compare something and then forgotten to put away. Addie stepped inside, intending only to close them and leave them neatly stacked. They were payroll records organized by year, 1 page for each sheet, employee names arranged alphabetically, followed by columns for job title, hours worked, and payment signatures. The page on top was from 1995. She picked it up to place it back in the folder, and her eyes drifted toward the job title column out of habit. The habit of someone whose profession was always placed at the bottom of every list, someone who kept looking to see where her own word appeared. Kitchen porter. 1 line listed kitchen porter. She looked across to the name column. Rosalia Castellani. Addie stood motionless for a long time. Then she turned to the page beneath it. 1994. The same name, the same position, beginning in March. She turned another page. 1996. The same name again, and in the final column for November, someone had written 3 short words in blue ink, the handwriting neat and slanted. Left the job. Beneath it was a signature. E. Whitfield. Addie placed all 3 pages side by side on the table beneath the only light still burning in the room, and she stood there with both hands still wet from dishwater, reading the same last name again and again, a name she'd heard for the first time only 18 days earlier, a name that made the entire kitchen fall silent whenever someone spoke it aloud. That woman had stood here, for 3 years, from 1994 through 1996, in this very kitchen, doing the same work Addie was doing now, washing the same pots Addie was washing, standing at the same sink exactly 20 steps from where Addie stood. And 30 years later, her son had carried her cast iron pot back into this place, set it on the steel table, and said that this was the 5th place. Addie returned the 3 pages to the folder, closed it, and placed it back on the shelf exactly where she'd found it. She turned off the records room light. She walked back to the washing station, stood staring at the sink for a long time, then touched the pocket of her apron, where the ceramic jar rested. And for the first time in 3 years, the kitchen no longer felt like a place of work. It felt like a place where someone had left something behind a very long time ago, and no one had ever returned to claim it. On the 21st day, the restaurant closed to guests at 11 o'clock in the morning. Mrs. Whitfield had the small private dining room cleared, leaving only a single table in the center with 3 place settings. In the kitchen, Mrs. Hale ordered everyone to change into fresh white aprons, even those who wouldn't take a single step outside the kitchen. Addie was instructed to remain at the washing station and go nowhere else. At 10 minutes to noon, the front door opened. Raphael Castellani entered first, followed by Tomas Brandt, and walking between the 2 men was a young woman in a beige coat, her hair tied low, both hands holding a small bag against her stomach as though it contained something that needed protecting. Mrs. Whitfield went all the way to the door to greet them. Mr. Castellani. Miss Castellani. Josephine, the young woman said. Josie is fine too. All 3 sat down. None of them removed their coats. In the kitchen, Mrs. Hale personally took her place at the service counter, and 2 cooks carried the plates out with both hands. White porcelain plates with narrow rims, 3 layers of beef cheek stacked upon one another, their surfaces gleaming beneath a dark sauce like polished wood. A streak of mashed potatoes drawn across the plate, so smooth that not a single ridge could be seen. 3 perfectly even drops of herb oil. On top, a tender young leaf placed with tweezers. Mrs. Hale followed the plates into the room and stood 2 steps from the table, with her hands clasped in front of her apron. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the finished version. Beef cheeks braised for 9 hours in red wine, the liquid strained and then reduced to 1/4 of its original volume. The potatoes have been passed through a sieve 3 times. Nearly everything written on the page you sent us is present on this plate, only elevated to the highest form our profession can give it. Tomas didn't touch his plate. He took the small notebook from his coat pocket, opened it, and wrote down a single line. Rafe didn't pick up his spoon either. He looked at his sister. Josie lifted her spoon. She took 1 bite. She chewed slowly, her eyes lowered toward the tabletop. Then she took a 2nd bite. Then she set the spoon down on the plate so gently that it made almost no sound. "It's very good, Mrs. Hale," she said. "But this isn't my mother's dish." Mrs. Hale smiled, the smile of someone who had heard that sentence many times and always kept an answer ready. "Miss Castellani, I understand that feeling, and I encounter it often. Our memories of childhood food are always different from the food itself. What you remember isn't the flavor. What you remember is that home. From a technical standpoint, I assure you that this plate is more accurate than anything ever cooked in that pot." "I believe you," Josie said. "I believe it's more accurate. Then. But I'm sitting here, eating the right dish, and I can't find my mother anywhere in it." Mrs. Hale fell silent. Josie pushed the plate about a hand's width away from herself. "Do you know which nights my mother made this? The nights she came home late from work? She'd come in, turn on the stove, put everything into 1 pot, and leave it there. Then she'd take a shower, come back out, stir it once, sit down in a chair, and fall asleep for about 20 minutes. The whole apartment carried that smell all evening. Not this smell. That one was stronger, rougher, and there was one part that always smelled slightly burned." She looked up. "You cooked it for 9 hours. My mother cooked it with the time she had, and she never had much. Miss Castellani, I can't place a hastily cooked stew on the table at a wedding. I'm not asking you to cook it hastily. I'm asking you to cook it correctly." Mrs. Hale turned toward Rafe, because in 22 years in the profession, she'd learned that when the young woman at the table was dissatisfied, the person paying the bill was the one who made the final decision. "Mr. Castellani, if you'd like, I can prepare another version next week, something stronger and rougher, exactly as your sister has described. We still have 3 weeks." Rafe didn't answer at once. He looked at his sister's plate, still nearly untouched, the 3 layers of meat disturbed in only one place where the spoon had entered twice. He studied it for quite a long time. Then he stood. He didn't push back his chair. He simply rose. And when he did, Mrs. Hale stepped back half a pace without realizing she'd moved. "Mrs. Hale," he said. His voice was as quiet as it had been when he first walked through the door 21 days earlier, and the entire room still had to fall silent to hear him clearly. "I visited 4 restaurants before coming here. The first cooked better than you. The third presented the dish more beautifully than you. All 4 told me exactly what you've just said, that my memory couldn't be trusted, and their food could." He fastened one button of his coat. "You've cooked me a very beautiful dish. You've simply killed the person who lived inside it." No one spoke. Mrs. Whitfield stood in the dining room doorway with one hand resting against the frame. Tomas closed his notebook and rose as well. Josie placed the strap of her bag over her shoulder, and before leaving, she paused beside the table and turned back to Mrs. Hale. There wasn't the slightest trace of anger in her voice, and because of that, her words carried more weight than any accusation could have. "I'm getting married on the 21st of next month. My mother has been gone for 13 years. There's only one thing I've asked for at my entire wedding, and that is for her to be present at the table that day." She walked toward the door. Only after the 3 of them had reached the sidewalk did Mrs. Whitfield step away from the doorway. She walked into the kitchen, stood in the middle of the aisle, and looked around once, as though making certain everyone was listening. 21 days, she said. "I promised that family 42 days, and we've just burned through half of them." Mrs. Hale set the plate down on the steel table harder than necessary. "People don't know what they want, Mrs. Whitfield. That's an ordinary part of this profession." "He knows exactly what he wants, Priscilla. He just said it very clearly. And he said it in a voice I've never heard anyone use inside my restaurant." She turned away. "Start over." At the far end of the kitchen, beside the washing sink, Addie stood motionless with both hands submerged in water, and inside the pocket of her apron, the ceramic jar remained exactly where it had been. The evening shift ended at 11:40 that night. Addie washed the last stack of trays, hung her apron on its hook, and instead of going home, she put on her coat and stepped into the rear alley. The 24-hour grocery store was 3 blocks from the restaurant, the place where night shift workers in the neighborhood stopped for cigarettes and coffee. She walked through the aisles with a photograph of the handwritten recipe open on her phone, and she bought exactly what was written there, not one thing more. 1 piece of shoulder meat, 4 potatoes, 3 carrots, 2 yellow onions, 1 bulb of garlic, 1 can of the cheapest canned tomatoes, the kind with the label printed crooked, 1 handful of dried bay leaves sealed in a plastic bag, coarse salt, pepper. She stood at the register, watched each item pass over the scanner, and counted along silently in her head. The cashier read the total aloud. A little over $11. Addie paid in cash, asked for the receipt, folded it, and slipped it into her coat pocket. Just before 1 o'clock, she unlocked the back door with her own key and stepped into the dark kitchen. She didn't turn on the main row of lights. She switched on only 2 bulbs above the center cooking station, just enough to see her hands. Then she went to the shelf beneath the steel table, took out the cast iron pot, placed it on the stove, and stood looking at it for a moment before turning on the flame. In 3.5 years, she'd never stood at this stove. She'd cleaned it thousands of times. She knew burner number 4 ran slightly weaker than the other 3, and she knew the valve on the left had to be turned a little past the mark before it caught. She knew all those things the way a person who cleaned knew them, not the way a person who cooked did. She lit the flame. She chopped the onions with her right hand, slowly, holding the body of the knife between the thumb and forefinger of her left hand to steady it, a way of gripping a knife that no school had ever taught and that she'd invented for herself over the past 3 years. She cooked the onions in the fat rendered from the shoulder meat itself. She didn't cook the garlic separately, didn't prepare a separate stock, and didn't strain anything, because nowhere on the page did it say anything about straining. She put everything into 1 pot in the exact order written on the paper, poured in enough water to cover it, placed the lid on top, and lowered the flame to the smallest level at which it would still burn. Then she sat down on the plastic chair in the corner of the kitchen and waited. At 2 o'clock in the morning, she lifted the lid and stirred once. At 2:30, she tasted it with the tip of her finger and added salt. At 3 o'clock, she stirred it again and sat back down. By 3:30, the smell inside the kitchen had grown so thick that it no longer remained inside the pot. It crept into the hallway, climbed the stairs, and became a scent no one who had cooked in this 2-star kitchen during the past 20 years had ever encountered, the scent of food prepared by someone who didn't need anyone to judge it. At 10 minutes to 4, footsteps sounded on the stairs. The kitchen door opened. Eleanor Whitfield stood there with a sweater over her nightclothes, her hair uncombed, one hand still holding the ring of office keys. She'd slept upstairs that night, as she always did whenever the restaurant had a major contract. "Who gave you permission to use this stove?" Addie rose from the chair. She made no attempt to hide anything, because there was nothing left to hide. "No one, ma'am." "Do you know how many terms of your contract you've just violated?" "I do." "Where did the ingredients come from?" Addie took the receipt from her coat pocket and handed it to her. "I bought the ingredients myself. The grocery store at the corner of Wells Street, at 12:45 this morning. I didn't take a single thing from the restaurant, not even the salt. The salt is on that receipt too, ma'am." Mrs. Whitfield took the paper, looked down at it, then raised her eyes toward the cast-iron pot simmering gently on burner number 2. She stood there for a long time, long enough for Addie to think she would lose her job that night rather than the following morning. Then Mrs. Whitfield set the ring of keys on the steel table. "Serve me a bowl." Addie took a bowl from the cabinet, filled it, and placed it on the table with a spoon. Mrs. Whitfield pulled out a chair and sat directly at the steel table in the middle of the kitchen, dressed in her nightclothes and sweater beneath the 2 bare lights. She took 1 spoonful. She looked down into the bowl. She took a 2nd spoonful, then a 3rd, and after the 4th, she set the spoon down, straightened her back, and said nothing. She remained silent for a very long time. In that silence, Addie could hear the pot simmering and the refrigerator humming at the far end of the kitchen. "How long did you cook it?" she asked. 2 hours and 40 minutes, ma'am." "The stock?" "There isn't any stock, only water." Mrs. Hale cooked hers for 9 hours and strained it 3 times. "Yes, ma'am, I know." Mrs. Whitfield lowered her eyes to the bowl again and studied it for a while. "I've eaten in my own restaurant for 40 years. I've eaten things that cost 100 times more than this." She paused. "How much did this cost?" Addie pointed toward the receipt, still lying on the table. "The whole pot cost $11, ma'am. Chef Hale's plate cost $208. Mrs. Whitfield picked up the receipt a 2nd time, and this time she read it from beginning to end, line by line, a list of the 11 cheapest things a late-night grocery store could sell. Then she folded it, slipped it into the pocket of her sweater, and stood. "Be here at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning." "No, 6 o'clock this morning. That's 2 hours from now." She picked up the ring of keys. "And you won't be washing dishes anymore." Addie stood motionless. "Ma'am, Mrs. Hale will. Mrs. Hale works for me. I don't work for Mrs. Hale." Mrs. Whitfield reached the doorway, then stopped, turned her head, and asked a question without explaining why she wanted to know. "Miss Vaughn, how long have you worked here?" 3 years and 2 months, ma'am. 3 years and 2 months. She nodded slowly, like someone who had just heard a number she hadn't wanted to hear. Then she switched off one of the 2 lights and went back upstairs. At 7 o'clock that morning, Mrs. Hale walked into the kitchen and saw Addie Vaughn standing at the center steel table with the cast-iron pot in front of her and an open notebook beside it. She went straight upstairs. The office door closed, but in a kitchen, preparing to open for lunch, no door was thick enough, and Mrs. Hale made no effort to lower her voice that day. "You're giving the Castellani family's main dish to the dishwasher?" "For 3 years, that girl has held nothing but a scouring pad and a spray hose, Mrs. Whitfield. She's never stood at a stove in a kitchen with a star. She finished cooking a pot at 4 o'clock this morning, and I ate it. At 4 o'clock in the morning, anything would have tasted good to you." "Priscilla." Mrs. Whitfield said only 1 sentence, and it was so brief that everyone in the kitchen below heard every word clearly. "I didn't ask for your opinion. You take care of the rest of the menu. Give that girl anything she needs." The door opened. Mrs. Hale came down the stairs, passed directly behind Addie without saying a word or even looking at her, and it was that refusal to look that made the 2 nearby cooks lower their heads toward their cutting boards. Throughout the lunch service, she worked as usual, spoke in her usual voice, and gave her usual orders. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when lunch service had just ended, and the kitchen was between shifts, she passed Addie's table and said very gently, "Miss Vaughn, come up to my office for a moment." The chef's office was at the end of the hallway, a small room with barely enough space for 1 desk and 2 chairs. Mrs. Hale closed the door, motioned for Addie to sit, then took the chair on the other side of the desk. She didn't scold her. She said nothing about the night before. She simply opened a drawer, took out a thick, pale yellow envelope, and pushed it across the desk toward Addie. "Open it." Addie didn't reach for it. "I told you to open it." She did. Inside was cash, arranged in bundles secured with paper bands, all $100 bills. She didn't count it. She didn't need to, because Mrs. Hale said the amount before Addie could even consider counting. 8,400. Addie looked up. For one brief second, she failed to hide anything, and Mrs. Hale saw it, and she didn't need to say anything more to make it clear that she knew. "Now listen until I've finished before you answer." She folded her hands on the desk. "I'm not firing you. I'm not writing a report about you using the stove without permission at 4 o'clock in the morning, even though that alone would be enough to have you out of here by this afternoon. And no one could defend you, not even Mrs. Whitfield. I'm letting it go." She pushed the envelope a little closer. "What I need is very simple. Tomorrow morning, you'll go to Mrs. Whitfield and tell her that I taught you that recipe. You'll say I asked you to prepare it in the old way, so we could compare the two versions. You'll say you were following my instructions last night. That's all. You'll still stand at the stove, and you'll still cook it. I won't touch your pot with a single finger. The dish will still be yours. I'll only take the name." Addie looked down at the envelope. "And don't imagine I'm doing this because I have money to spare," Mrs. Hale said. "I'm doing it because of 22 years. Do you understand how long 22 years is? I entered this kitchen before you'd even started school. If the entire city learns tomorrow that the Castellani family's dish was cooked by a dishwasher, then what do those 22 years become?" She paused. Then she spoke the final words, very softly. "Your brother stays where he is, Adeline. He won't have to be moved anywhere." Addie sat motionless. She could hear pots striking against one another in the kitchen below. She thought about the 90-minute drive each way. She thought about what the nurse had said, that she wouldn't be able to visit him anymore. Then she reached out and took the envelope. Mrs. Hale didn't smile. She only nodded once. "Tomorrow morning." Addie carried the envelope downstairs, placed it in her coat pocket, finished the evening shift, and took it home. Her rented room was on the second floor above a laundromat, and it held only one table against the window. She placed the envelope on the table. She sat down in front of it. She didn't open it again. She rested her left hand on the tabletop beside the envelope, the hand marked by a scar running from her wrist to her little finger, the finger that still wouldn't straighten, and she remained that way for a very long time. She told herself it required only one sentence, not a deed, not an action of any kind. Only one sentence spoken the following morning, and not $1 of that 8,400 had been stolen. No one would lose anything. The dish would still be cooked exactly as it was meant to be cooked, and her brother would remain in the room, with the window overlooking the row of trees where he'd spent the past 3 years. She imagined that the following Thursday, she would still be able to pull the chair close to his bed and tell Owen stories about the kitchen. Then she thought about the cast iron pot, the 2 initials carved into its bottom, and the woman named Rosalia, who had stood at the same sink as Addie for 3 years before a single signature ended her employment. The streetlights outside the window went dark as dawn approached. Addie didn't sleep for a single minute. Just before 6 o'clock, she washed her face, put on her coat, picked up the envelope, and walked to the restaurant. Mrs. Hale was hanging her coat on the hook when Addie knocked on the office door. She placed the envelope on the desk and pushed it toward Mrs. Hale in exactly the same way Mrs. Hale had pushed it toward her the afternoon before. "I'm giving it back." Mrs. Hale looked at the envelope, then at her. "Have you thought this through?" "I thought about it all night." "Then you haven't thought hard enough." "Ma'am," Addie said, her voice hoarse from a sleepless night, "if I take it, what I'm selling isn't the recipe. It's someone's mother." She turned toward the door. Only when her hand was already resting on the doorknob did she stop and ask the question she hadn't dared allow herself to consider throughout the night. "Mrs. Hale, I haven't told anyone in this restaurant about my brother. Not one person." Mrs. Hale picked up the envelope, returned it to the drawer, and closed the drawer. "Go do your work, Miss Vaughn." Mrs. Whitfield stood at the head of the steel table, watching the 11th pot being ladled into a bowl, and she didn't need to taste it again, because she'd already tasted the 10 that came before. 11 times, Adeline. 4 days left. Addie untied her apron at 11 o'clock that night and carried the ceramic jar home. She placed it on the table beside the window, in the same spot where the yellow envelope had rested several nights earlier. She knew she was missing one thing. 11 pots of stew over 3 weeks. and she'd changed every variable she could change. The cooking time, the flame, the order of the ingredients, the amount of water. She'd cooked it more slowly, cooked it more quickly, let it cool overnight, and reheated it exactly the way someone coming home late from work would. And every time Mrs. Whitfield nodded and said it was good, delicious, but not yet right. There were 14 ingredients on the handwritten page. She'd used all 14. What was missing wasn't written on the page. It was inside this ceramic jar, and she'd carried it home for 4 nights without being able to unlock its secret. On the first night, she poured warm water into the jar and left it there until morning, hoping the hardened block of spices inside would soften. By dawn, only the top layer had loosened. She scraped it onto a white plate, spread it thin, and sat there smelling it. There was pepper. She recognized pepper immediately. There was something from the dried pepper family, something sweet rather than hot. There was the scent of dried leaves, but it wasn't bay leaf. She identified 3 things that first night, and all 3 were already written on the page. On the second night, she soaked it longer and used the tip of a small knife to separate the block of spices into pieces according to color. She arranged 7 pieces on the plate, with small spaces between them, then smelled each one 3 times, and between every attempt she stood, opened the window, and let her nose rest. She recognized 2 more things. Both were already on the page as well, but the third scent, the faintly scorched, faintly bitter scent she'd noticed that first night at the restaurant's back door, still refused to separate from everything else. It clung to all of it. It lay beneath all of it. The third night was the worst. She sat from midnight until 4 o'clock in the morning with the white plate in front of her and couldn't identify anything more. Near dawn, her sense of smell went numb, and everything on the plate began to smell the same. She turned the plate upside down, switched off the light, lay on the bed, and remained there with her eyes open until morning. On the 4th night, she tried something different. She didn't sit there smelling it anymore. She poured all the spices she'd separated into a bowl, covered them with boiling water, placed a plate over the top, and left them to steep like tea. Then she waited 10 minutes without doing anything at all. When she lifted the plate, steam rose directly into her face, and within that hot vapor, the third scent broke free from everything else and stood alone, so clearly that she had to set the plate down. She knew it. She'd known it for all 4 nights. She hadn't recognized it because she'd kept searching for it among the spices, and it had never belonged there. It was orange peel. Dried orange peel. But not orange peel dried properly, not the golden kind restaurants bought in bags, the kind that carried only fragrance and acidity. The orange peel inside this jar had been burned, not burned all the way to charcoal, only scorched. Scorched at the edges, scorched until its sweetness had changed into a faint bitterness that lingered at the back of the tongue, and that faint bitterness was what kept the entire stew from becoming too rich after the 4th spoonful. Addie sat before the bowl for a very long time. Then she stood, walked to the small stove in the corner of the room, took the 2 oranges she'd bought the day before, peeled them, and cut the peel into thin strips. She turned on the oven. She dried them at a low temperature, correctly, the way anyone who'd attended culinary school would, until the strips turned a beautiful golden orange, exactly as they appeared in books. She lifted one strip and smelled it. It was fragrant. It was clean. It was correct. And it wasn't right. She stood there holding the orange peel and understood that if she put this into the pot, she would create something better, and she would fail in exactly the same way Mrs. Hale had failed. The woman named Rosalia hadn't dried orange peel at a low temperature. She hadn't owned an oven for that purpose, and she hadn't had the time. She'd done something else. She'd done it faster. And one day she'd left it over the heat too long, and instead of throwing away that scorched batch of orange peel, she'd put it into the pot. And when the 2 children finished eating, they asked for more. Addie sat on the edge of the bed, and for a while, she stopped thinking about work. She thought about some small apartment 30 years earlier, about an evening when someone came home late and turned on the stove, about a cast-iron pot placed in the middle of a table, and about 2 children fighting to scrape the bottom of that pot with 2 wooden spoons, each insisting that the burned part at the bottom was the best, both laughing so loudly that their mother had to tell them to be quiet because the neighbors were asleep. Then the 2 children argued over who the pot belonged to, and instead of choosing between them, their mother handed them a small knife and let them carve their names into the bottom, 1 letter for each child. with a small line joining the two so they would never have to argue again. She let them play. She sat there watching and didn't scold them once. Addie stood, pushed the beautifully dried orange peel aside, and peeled the second orange. She lit the stove, placed a dry pan over medium heat, scattered the strips of peel across it, and stood there watching them change color. Yellow, deep yellow, brown at the edges. She waited one moment longer, the exact moment when everything inside her was shouting that she needed to lift the pan from the flame. She didn't. Only when the edges of the orange peel had blackened and the room filled with that same faintly scorched, faintly bitter scent did she turn off the heat and pour the strips onto a plate. Then she picked one up, placed it in her mouth, and closed her eyes. At 4 o'clock in the morning, she wrapped the scorched orange peel in a piece of paper, slipped it into her coat pocket beside the ceramic jar, and for the first time in 4 nights, she slept for 2 hours. At 11:30 the following night, when every light in the kitchen had been turned off except those above the center cooking station, Addie stood alone before the cast-iron pot and dropped the handful of scorched orange peel into the 12th batch. She replaced the lid, lowered the flame, and for the next 5 minutes, nothing happened. Then the scent changed. It didn't grow stronger. It simply became different. As though someone had opened a door inside a room where she hadn't known a door existed. Addie stood motionless, staring at the lid, both hands braced against the edge of the steel table, and she remained that way long enough not to hear the back door open. "You let it burn." She turned around. Rafael Castellani stood in the doorway leading to the rear hall, alone, without Tomas, his coat still buttoned, his hands in his pockets. She didn't know how long he'd been standing there. She hadn't heard a car, hadn't heard footsteps, and in 3.5 years of working nights in that kitchen, no one had ever entered without her hearing them. "Yes," she said, "I let it burn. Does Mrs. Whitfield know? She knows I'm cooking. She doesn't know what I put into it yet." He stepped inside, walked to within about 3 paces of the steel table, and stopped there, coming no closer. He didn't sit. "The back door was unlocked," he said. "The back door is locked, sir. I opened it for the milk delivery at 11 o'clock, and I haven't locked it again yet." He nodded once, as though it were the correct answer, and he intended to remember it. Then he looked at the pot. "They say you nearly went to Paris once." "People say many things, sir. When people speak to me, they're usually telling the truth." Addie didn't answer. She picked up the ladle, removed the lid, stirred once in a slow circle, and covered the pot again. Rafe watched her hand as she worked. He watched the right hand holding the ladle, then looked toward the left hand resting against the rim of the pot to steady it, the hand with a scar running from the wrist to the little finger, the finger that couldn't straighten and remained slightly curled as though it were still trying to hold on to something. He looked for quite a long time. He didn't ask. Addie saw him looking, and she didn't pull down her sleeve or hide her hand behind her back as she usually did in front of strangers. She left it where it was. She didn't explain either. The two of them stood that way for a while, and within that silence, something was settled between them without either of them having to speak. "Mrs. Hale is no longer involved," he said. "Yes. Did she accept that?" "No, sir. Are you afraid of her?" Addie thought for a moment before answering because she wanted the answer to be exact. "I'm afraid of losing my job, sir. That much is true. And yet you're standing here at midnight, cooking a dish your head chef said wasn't worthy of this restaurant." "Yes." "Why?" She set the ladle down. "Because this pot has names carved into the bottom, sir. And I'm the only person in this kitchen who saw them." Rafe said nothing. He remained there, 3 paces from the table, and something in his face shifted so slightly that Addie would have missed it if she hadn't been looking directly at him. Then he pulled his right hand from his coat pocket. He was holding a small object wrapped in a piece of cloth. He placed it on the steel table between them and unfolded the fabric. It was a wooden spoon with a broken handle, only half of it remaining, the broken edge worn smooth from being held over many years. Addie recognized it immediately. She'd found it at the bottom of the cardboard box that night, placed it on a clean tray beside the scorched pot holder, and the following morning, Tomas had come to retrieve both objects without explaining why. "I heard you found this in the box, Mrs. Hale ordered you to throw away," Rafe said. "Yes." "You took it out and placed it on a clean tray." "Yes." "Why didn't you throw it away?" "You were told to discard the entire box, because someone had arranged rags over the jar to keep it from breaking, sir. People don't use rags to protect something they intend to throw away." Rafe pushed the broken spoon toward her, sliding it a short distance across the steel. "It's yours, sir. My mother stirred that pot with this spoon. It broke when I was 10, and she never replaced it. She said once your hand has grown accustomed to something, you shouldn't change it." He fastened the button of his coat again. "You're cooking in her pot. You should stir it with her spoon." Addie looked at the spoon lying on the steel table. 2 nights earlier, she'd pushed an envelope back across a desk. And she knew that feeling well. The feeling of moving something away, because she understood that taking it would place her in someone's debt. But this was different. This had no price. She reached out and picked it up. She held it in her right hand, turned it once, ran her thumb over the smooth, worn break, then placed it beside the cast-iron pot, exactly where the restaurant's stainless steel ladle had been resting, and removed the ladle. "Thank you." Rafe watched her do it. Then he smiled. It wasn't a laugh, only the slightest lift at the corner of his mouth, held there for perhaps 2 seconds. But it was the first time in 30 days that anyone in that kitchen had seen his expression change. "You're the first person in 10 years to take something from me without asking what it costs." He turned toward the door. When he reached the doorway, he stopped without looking back. 3 days left, Miss Vaughn." "Yes, sir. Lock the back door." Then he left. Addie listened until the sound of his car disappeared completely from the alley. Then she went out and locked the door. When she returned, she lifted the lid from the pot, picked up the broken wooden spoon, and stirred the first circle. On the 37th night, Addie turned off the stove at 11 o'clock. The stew was finished. She let it cool, moved it to the holding station, covered it, and placed a strip of paper tape on the lid with the date and time written according to procedure. Then she did one additional thing the rules didn't require. She ladled out a small bowl, covered it with plastic wrap, and placed it in the employee refrigerator in the corner of the changing room. The refrigerator, where everyone in the kitchen kept their lunch containers and bottles of water. She didn't do it for any particular reason. She only wanted to taste it cold with a spoon the following morning before reheating it, because stew left overnight was always different from stew that had just been cooked, and she wanted to know exactly how different it would be. She washed her hands, hung up her apron, placed the broken wooden spoon in her private drawer, locked the back door, and left at 11:20. At 11:45, the delivery door on the side of the building opened. That door didn't use a keycard. It had only an interior bolt, and if someone pulled the bolt back during the afternoon, then at night, all it took was a push to enter. Priscilla Hale stepped into the dark kitchen without turning on the main lights. She wore rubber gloves, the kind everyone in the kitchen used when preparing fish. She went directly to the cold storage door, entered 6 numbers on the keypad, heard the lock release, and opened it. On the lowest shelf inside was a sack of curing salt, the kitchen used for preserving fish and cleaning the racks. Coarse gray crystals that were never brought into the main cooking area. She filled a small bowl. She didn't weigh it. It was the first time in 2 years that she'd taken salt without placing it on a scale. And she moved quickly, like someone who knew that if she slowed down for even 1 second, she would begin to think. She lifted the lid from the holding pot. The cold steam from the overnight stew rose faintly. She poured in the bowl of salt, took a stainless steel ladle, and stirred exactly 4 times so the salt dissolved toward the bottom. Then she replaced the lid and straightened the strip of paper tape until it looked exactly as it had before. After that, she walked to the drawer beneath the steel table where Addie kept her belongings. She opened it. Inside were the broken wooden spoon, a notebook, and the small earthen ceramic jar with the wooden lid. She picked up the jar, removed the lid, and smelled it. She breathed in the scent for quite a long time. Then she replaced the lid, carried the jar to the washing station at the far end of the kitchen, the sink where that woman had stood for 3 years and 2 months, turned the hot water on as far as it would go, and tipped the jar upside down. The softened block of spices slid out in brown pieces, dissolved in the water, and disappeared down the drain. She left the water running for a long time after the jar was empty. Then she placed the empty jar on the rim of the sink, removed her gloves, slipped them into her coat pocket, and left through the same delivery door, fastening the bolt behind her. She didn't touch the wooden spoon. At 9 o'clock the following morning, Addie arrived. She opened the employee refrigerator, took out the small bowl, tasted 1 cold spoonful, nodded to herself, covered it again, and left it there. She carried the holding pot out to reheat it. At 10 o'clock, when the stew had warmed evenly, she tasted it 1 final time. She tasted it with the broken wooden spoon. It was right. It was exactly as it had been the night before, exactly as it had been for the past 4 days, the faint bitterness of the scorched orange peel resting at the back of the tongue and keeping everything from becoming too rich. She transferred it to the warming pot, lowered the heat to its smallest setting, and at that moment, only one thought occupied her mind. The Castellani family would arrive at 11:30, and she would taste it once more immediately before it was served, because that was the one thing she always did. That was when she noticed the ceramic jar sitting on the rim of the sink. She picked it up. It was empty. She stared at it, and her entire body went cold, not because of the food, because she'd tasted the stew 10 minutes earlier and it was still right, but because this jar was the last thing the woman named Rosalia had closed with her own hands. "Who washed this jar?" she called across the kitchen. No one answered. Marisol looked up, then lowered her eyes again. At the far end of the kitchen, Mrs. Hale was rearranging a row of white porcelain plates without turning around. "Miss Vaughn, it's 11:30. Are you planning to create a scene over a jar?" Addie set the empty jar on the table. She stood there for several seconds, with one hand still resting on it. Then she turned back toward the warming pot, lifted the lid, picked up the wooden spoon, and prepared to taste it again. At 10:20, Mrs. Hale walked past, stopped, looked Addie over from head to toe, and spoke in a voice Addie had never heard her use with her in 3 years and 2 months. "Miss Vaughn?" Addie looked up. "Are you planning to meet the Castellani family wearing that apron?" Addie looked down. Her apron had already endured 4 hours of morning kitchen work. There was oil along the hem, and a dark streak across the chest where she'd wiped her hands. "This is my apron, ma'am. This is your day, Adeline. People will remember today for the rest of their lives." Mrs. Hale meant those words, and the sincerity in them was what made them frightening. "The uniform closet is on the 2nd floor, the last room on the left. Take a white one. Your size is on the 2nd shelf. Go. I'll watch the pot." Addie placed the wooden spoon on the edge of the table. She hesitated for exactly 1 beat. One very brief beat. The beat she would later replay in her mind thousands of times. Then she thanked Mrs. Hale and climbed the stairs. The uniform closet on the 2nd floor was locked. Addie had to walk halfway back down the stairs and ask Marisol where the key was kept. Marisol didn't know, and had to find the supply manager. The supply manager was outside in the alley receiving a delivery. By the time Addie opened the closet, found the 2nd shelf, changed into the white apron, and retied the strings behind her back, the clock on the changing room wall read 10:35. She returned downstairs. The stew had already been ladled out and divided among small cast-iron pots, arranged on trays, and covered with lids, and 2 cooks were standing beside the trays waiting for the order to carry them out. The broken wooden spoon remained exactly where she'd left it, on the edge of the table. "Everything's ready," Mrs. Hale said. "Go into the dining room. They're here." This time, 9 people came. Raphael Castellani entered first, Tomas half a step behind him, then Josie, then the young man she was going to marry, followed by 5 relatives from her father's side, including an uncle over 70 with silver hair and a cane, a man the entire group stopped to wait for whenever his steps slowed. Mrs. Whitfield had 3 tables joined together to form one long table in the center of the small dining room. No one removed a coat, just as before. Addie stood in the doorway connecting the kitchen to the dining room, wearing the white apron she'd just taken from the 2nd floor, both hands resting in front of her stomach. Mrs. Hale stood 1 step behind her. The trays were carried out. 9 small cast-iron pots resting on 9 wooden stands, their lids still closed. 2 cooks placed one before each person, then stepped back, and at Mrs. Whitfield's signal, they lifted all 9 lids at once. Steam rose in 9 slender columns. Josie picked up her spoon. She lowered it into the pot, filled it, and raised it. But the spoon reached only the height of her chest before it stopped. She froze. She didn't taste it. She sat motionless with the full spoon in her hand, staring down into the pot, and her face changed very slowly, the way a face changes when someone has just heard news they haven't yet fully understood. Then she placed the spoon on the wooden stand. She said nothing. Her uncle didn't notice. He had already taken half a spoonful before anyone had time to look toward him. He stopped midway. His entire body stiffened, and he spat it into his napkin right there at the table, without the slightest attempt at courtesy. Then he reached for his water and drank for a long time. He set the glass down so hard that the entire table trembled. "What kind of game is this?" He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. He was speaking to the whole room, and his voice struck the sealed dining room like a slap. "Did you pay them to mock your mother, Raphael?" Rafe didn't answer. He picked up his own spoon, took a small portion, tasted it, and set the spoon down. He didn't spit it out. He only placed the spoon on the table and straightened in his chair, and the silence in him brought the entire table to stillness. The uncle wasn't finished. 13 years, he said, one hand trembling on the top of his cane. "I haven't tasted my sister's cooking in 13 years. You called me all the way here and told me you'd found someone who could make it again. And they serve me this." Josie's future husband placed a hand on her shoulder. She sat motionless with both hands in her lap, staring at the little pot before her as though, if she stared long enough, the smell might somehow change back. Mrs. Whitfield stepped forward. Her face had gone white. "Mr. Castellani, I..." But she couldn't finish because Mrs. Hale had already stepped in front of her. Mrs. Hale passed Addie, walked into the center of the room, clasped her hands before her apron, and spoke with the calm voice of someone who had prepared these words long ago. "Mr. Castellani, I apologize. I apologize on behalf of this restaurant, and I want to make something clear right now, in front of your family, so no one has to guess." She turned and pointed toward the kitchen doorway. "I didn't cook this dish. For the past 3 weeks, the person standing over that pot has been Miss Adeline Vaughn." Everyone at the table looked toward Addie. 3 weeks ago, she was still scrubbing floors here. "Mrs. Hale continued, speaking slowly so that every word had time to fall. "For 3 years and 2 months, she worked the night shift, washed dishes, and cleaned the kitchen. She had never spent a single day cooking in this restaurant until 3 weeks ago." I objected. "I told Mrs. Whitfield directly that this was a contract for your family and couldn't be handed to someone in that position. I was overruled. I accepted it because I'm an employee." She turned back toward Rafe. "And there's one more thing I believe you should know, sir. She's the only person who remains here alone every night. She alone has a key to the back door. For the past 3 weeks, from 11 o'clock at night until morning, there has been no one in this kitchen except her and your mother's pot." Addie stepped out of the doorway. "It was still right last night," she said. "I swear to you, at 10 o'clock this morning, I tasted it with your mother's own spoon. It was right. Someone put something into that pot." "When could that have happened?" Mrs. Hale asked. "Between 10 o'clock and 10:35. I wasn't in the kitchen." "Why weren't you here?" "Because you told me to go upstairs and change my uniform." Mrs. Hale turned toward the Castellani family and spoke to them rather than to Addie. "I told her to change out of an oil-stained apron before meeting you. Everyone in the kitchen heard me say it, and during that half hour, there were 14 people working in the kitchen." She left the sentence unfinished and allowed them to complete the rest themselves. "Who are you blaming now, Miss Vaughn?" Addie looked around the table. 9 people, 9 faces, and not one of them was searching for a reason to believe her. She looked toward Mrs. Whitfield. Mrs. Whitfield stood there with one hand gripping the back of a chair, and she didn't speak. She didn't say that at 4 o'clock that morning, she had eaten a bowl and remained silent for a very long time. She didn't say that the order had come from her. She only stood there, pale, her eyes lowered toward the floor of her own restaurant. And in those 30 seconds, she became someone entirely different from the woman who had lifted an $11 receipt and read every line. The uncle struck his cane against the floor. "We're leaving. I won't sit here another minute." Rafe stood. He didn't look at Mrs. Hale. He didn't look at Mrs. Whitfield. He looked at Addie for exactly 2 seconds, and there was no anger on his face. Nothing at all, and it was that emptiness that sent cold through her spine, because she understood that this man had just placed her among the people he would never think about again. He buttoned his coat. "Come on, Josie." Everyone at the table rose. Chairs scraped backward, and the 9 small cast-iron pots remained untouched on their wooden stands. Their lids open, the steam already gone. Josie was the last to stand, and as she passed the kitchen doorway, she looked at Addie once, not with anger, only exhaustion, the look of someone who had just lost all over again, the one thing she'd spent 13 years trying to find. Addie didn't think. She turned, ran back into the kitchen, pushed open the changing room door, opened the employee refrigerator in the corner, and took out the small bowl she'd set aside the night before, the bowl still sealed beneath its plastic wrap, still cold. She held it against her chest and ran into the lobby. All 9 of them had already reached the front door. Josie's future husband was holding it open, Her uncle had one foot on the front step, and Tomas stood beside Rafe with his notebook already tucked into his coat pocket. "Mr. Castellani," she called louder than she'd intended. Everyone in the lobby turned around, and Mrs. Hale, who had been walking behind them, stepped diagonally across Addie's path and blocked her. "How much further do you intend to humiliate this restaurant, Adeline? They've already reached the door. Let them leave." "Please move, ma'am. What are you holding? Are you planning to force that family to eat it again?" Mrs. Hale reached for the bowl, and Mrs. Whitfield, who had stood silently in the dining room for the past 10 minutes without speaking a single word, suddenly stepped forward. She came from behind, placed a hand on Mrs. Hale's arm, and pulled her aside with a strength no one would have imagined a 63-year-old woman still possessed. "Move, Priscilla." Mrs. Hale turned toward her, stunned. "Mrs. Whitfield," I said, "move." The path opened. Addie took 3 steps into the center of the lobby. She didn't approach a table, didn't offer the bowl to anyone, and didn't say a word about asking anyone to taste anything. She simply stood beneath the high ceiling in the middle of the lobby, 7 or 8 steps from the front door, and peeled away the plastic wrap. For 30 years, that lobby had been designed so the smell of food would never escape from the kitchen. But that afternoon, the dining room was closed to guests. The exhaust fans had been turned off. The front door stood open, and a current of air was blowing in from the street. The scent traveled ahead of Addie. It crossed the empty lobby, reached the 9 people standing at the door, and touched Josie Castellani first. She was stepping down onto the first stair. She stopped. Her whole body went still, one hand still resting on the doorframe, and she didn't turn around immediately. She remained that way long enough for her future husband to call her name twice. Then she turned her head. "What is that?" Her voice didn't sound like her own. It was small, and it broke in the middle. "What is that smell?" Addie stood still with the bowl resting in both hands. "It's orange peel, miss. Dried orange peel that was allowed to scorch." Josie released the doorframe. She walked back into the lobby, each step faster than the one before, and stopped 3 paces from Addie. She bent down to look into the bowl, then raised both hands to cover her mouth. "Mom always burned that part," she said through her fingers. "Her whole life. There was always one part that burned. We thought she'd ruined it. We used to tease her. We'd say, 'Mom, you forgot the pot again.' And she would only laugh. She never argued with us." She looked up, searching for her brother. Raphael Castellani was already standing there. He had entered the lobby without anyone hearing him, as he always did, and now he stood 1 step from his sister, his eyes fixed on the small bowl in the hands of the woman wearing the white apron. He didn't lean down to smell it. He didn't need to. "Mom didn't ruin it," he said. His voice was as quiet as always, but this time the entire lobby fell silent to hear him. Not because they were afraid. She couldn't bear to throw it away. She burned 1 batch of orange peel, and she didn't discard it. She put it into the pot. Then she saw the 2 of us fighting to scrape the bottom clean. So the next year, she burned it again. She did it on purpose. He paused. "For 13 years, I thought that was the part I remembered wrong." The uncle walked into the center of the lobby with the help of his cane, stopped, drew in 1 long breath, and closed his eyes. "Rosalia," the man over 70 whispered. Only that single word. Josie sank to the lobby floor, exactly where she stood, both hands covering her face, and her future husband had to kneel beside her, 1 hand supporting her shoulder. No one helped her stand. The entire lobby allowed her to remain there. Rafe turned toward Addie. "How did you find it?" "It was in the ceramic jar sent with the pot, sir. The jar was at the bottom of the box of old belongings, and someone had arranged rags over it to keep it from breaking." She continued slowly because she knew this was the only time in her life she would ever be allowed to say these words. "It took me 4 nights to separate it from everything else. I found it on the 4th night, and I dried 1 batch of orange peel properly, at the correct temperature, beautiful and fragrant, exactly the way they teach you in school. It tasted better. Then I threw it away and burned another batch. Why? Because recreating an old dish isn't about making it taste better, sir. It's about letting someone taste the person they've lost." Rafe looked at her for a very long time. He looked at the bowl, then at her left hand supporting its base, the hand marked by a scar, with a little finger that wouldn't straighten. "What about the pot of stew in there?" "Someone poured salt into it, sir. Coarse salt. I tasted it at 10 o'clock this morning, and it was still right." When I came back downstairs at 10:35, it had already been portioned onto the trays. Mrs. Hale stood at the edge of the lobby, her hands still clasped in front of her apron, and said nothing. Addie turned toward her and, for the first time in 3 years and 2 months, looked directly into her face. "But that isn't what I regret most, ma'am." She placed the small bowl gently on the reception desk, as though setting down something fragile. Then she reached into her apron pocket and took out the empty ceramic jar, the jar she'd found on the rim of the sink at 10 o'clock that morning, and handed it to Raphael Castellani. "I found this beside the sink this morning. Someone opened it, emptied everything inside it down the drain, and left the water running for a very long time." He took the jar. He held it with both hands. "I can cook the dish again, sir," Addie said. "I can't replace the jar." Rafe placed the empty ceramic jar on the reception desk beside the small bowl. He didn't shout at anyone. He didn't ask Addie another question. He merely turned his head slightly and called, "Tomas." "Yes. Please take the family home first. Uncle Sal goes in the first car. Josie goes with Danny." He looked down at his sister, who was still sitting on the lobby floor. "Go home and rest. I'm staying. I'm staying with you. Josie." She stood, brushed off her hands, and walked toward the door without looking back. 3 minutes later, only 5 people remained in the lobby. Rafe, Tomas, Mrs. Whitfield, Mrs. Hale, and Addie. Tomas closed both front doors and slid the bolt into place, and the sound of that bolt was the last sound heard in the lobby for a long while. "Miss Vaughn," Rafe said, "from 11 o'clock last night until 10 o'clock this morning, who entered the kitchen?" "I locked the back door at 11:20 and went home, sir. I opened it again at 9 o'clock this morning. I wasn't here during the time in between." "Does the restaurant have security cameras, Mrs. Whitfield?" "There are cameras in the dining room and the lobby. There aren't any in the kitchen. Health regulations don't allow cameras in food preparation areas." "The delivery entrance?" "No camera, Mrs." Hale stood beside the dining room door with her hands still clasped in front of her apron. She said nothing, and her face had returned to the calm expression of someone who knew this would end with no one able to prove anything. Rafe understood that. He also understood that if the matter ended there, the woman in the white apron standing in the middle of the lobby would be the one who lost everything. "Then there's nothing in this kitchen that recorded what happened last night," he said. Addie looked up. "There is, sir." Everyone in the lobby turned toward her. "There's a logbook." She walked into the kitchen and went directly to the metal rack mounted on the wall beside the washing sink, the place where no one in the restaurant had stopped for longer than 3 seconds during the past 3 years and 2 months. She took down a blue hardcover notebook with all 4 corners worn away, carried it into the lobby, and placed it on the reception desk. The night shift sanitation log. The person on night duty is required to complete it before locking the door. Refrigerator temperatures, the number of pots scrubbed, the condition of the drains, and anyone remaining in the kitchen when the door is locked. I've written in it every night for the past 3 years. Mrs. Whitfield stared at the notebook. "That's still being used?" "Yes, ma'am. It's required by the city's sanitation regulations." "Who reads it?" "No one, ma'am. In 3 years and 2 months, no one has opened it." Rafe pushed the notebook toward Tomas. "Read it." Tomas picked it up, turned to the last page containing writing, and read in the same voice he used to read everything. Steady, neither fast nor slow, with no emphasis placed anywhere. Night 37, 11:15. Refrigerator temperature, 4 degrees. Freezer temperature, -18 degrees. 19 pots and pans scrubbed. Washing station drain clear. Stew for the Castellani contract transferred to the holding area and labeled with the time. People remaining in the kitchen when I locked the back door. None. He paused. There's another line beneath it. Read it. Additional note. The cold storage door indicator illuminated at 11:03 and turned off at 11:06. I recorded it because I didn't open the cold storage room tonight. I don't have the access code. Tomas closed the notebook. No one spoke. Why did you write that down? Mrs. Whitfield asked, her voice hoarse. Because regulations require every irregularity in the storage area to be recorded, ma'am. If the cold storage room is opened without anyone documenting it, and food is spoiled the following day, the night shift worker is held responsible. I wrote it down to protect myself. I've recorded things like that for 3 years, and no one has ever asked me about them. Tomas opened his own small notebook, wrote 1 line, then looked up at Mrs. Whitfield. Ma'am, how many people know the cold storage code? Mrs. Whitfield didn't answer immediately. She looked toward Mrs. Hale. Mrs. Whitfield, Tomas repeated. How many? For the past 3 years, only 3 people have had the cold storage code, she said. Me, Mrs. Hale, and the former inventory manager, who retired in September last year. The code was changed the same day. The lobby fell silent. Mrs. Hale lowered her hands. I went into cold storage to get ice, she said. At 11 o'clock at night? Tomas asked. I returned to the restaurant to collect something. Which entrance did you use, ma'am? The back door was locked at 11:20, and Miss Vaughn had the key. The front entrance is covered by cameras. We can check the footage. Mrs. Hale didn't answer. The delivery entrance, Tomas said. An interior bolt. Anyone who pulled the bolt back during the afternoon could simply push the door open that night. Still, no one spoke, and it was at that moment, within that silence, while everyone in the lobby waited for her to say something that might save her, that Mrs. Hale said something else instead, something she hadn't meant to say, something that escaped because she had been driven into a corner where the only way left to defend herself was to prove that she'd had a reason. I didn't do this because I'm cruel. She turned toward Addie. I gave you a way out. I offered you the full $8,400, every last dollar, and all you had to do was say one sentence. I wasn't taking your dish. I was only taking the name. How did you know that amount? Addie asked. Mrs. Hale fell silent. Mrs. Hale, I haven't told anyone in this restaurant about my brother. Not one person. How did you know the exact amount, down to the last dollar? And Mrs. Hale answered in the exhausted voice of someone who had nowhere left to retreat. I searched your locker. I found the letter from the care center. Mrs. Whitfield spun toward her. You opened an employee's locker? Locker number 22. Combination lock. Every head chef here has the employee locker code list. You gave it to me in 2011, in case someone left unexpectedly, and their belongings remained inside. Mrs. Whitfield stood there with one hand gripping the edge of the reception desk. She looked at Addie. She looked at the blue notebook with its 4 worn corners lying on the desk. Then she lowered her eyes to the words printed along its spine, the same wording her family had ordered from the printer for 3 generations. 2 small English words identifying exactly who the notebook belonged to. Kitchen porter. Mrs. Whitfield read those 2 words, and her whole body seemed to collapse inward. She dropped into the velvet chair beside the reception desk, the chair reserved for waiting guests, and covered her eyes with one hand. In 1996, she said, I signed the termination papers for a dishwasher. No one understood what she was talking about. No one, except Addie. She often asked to take the leftover food at the end of the shift home to her 2 children. The head chef at the time came upstairs and reported her to me, said it wasn't allowed, that all leftover food had to be thrown away, that rules were rules. I said that was right. The law was the law, and she should follow it. She lowered her hand from her eyes. I signed that paper upstairs. I didn't even look at the woman's face when I signed it. I didn't come down to the kitchen. I didn't know her name. She raised her eyes toward Raphael Castellani. I know it now. Then she turned toward Addie, and her voice broke in the middle. You've been in this kitchen for 3 years, and I've never asked your name either. Outside on the street, the last car carrying the Castellani family pulled away from the curb. The sound of its engine faded into the distance and disappeared completely. Exactly 5 people remained in the lobby. The front doors were bolted, and no one turned on another light, even though the sky outside had already begun to darken into gray. Raphael Castellani lifted the empty ceramic jar from the reception desk. He held it in both hands just as he had when Addie gave it to him, turning it slightly to examine the wooden lid and its decaying rubber ring, then slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. He did it very slowly, and while he did, no one in the lobby dared breathe too deeply. Then he spoke without looking at anyone. Tomas. Yes. Take her to the car. 4 words. He spoke no louder than when he'd asked about the cold storage code. He didn't point, didn't turn his head toward Mrs. Hale, and didn't add a single word to explain what the car meant, where it would go, or what would happen once they reached it. And because of that, everyone in the lobby understood at once, understood with a kind of knowledge that had no need for language. Mrs. Whitfield sprang from her chair and couldn't manage a single word. Mrs. Hale went deathly pale. She stepped back half a pace until her back struck the dining room doorframe, and for the first time that day, Her hands fell away from their clasped position in front of her apron. "Mr. Castellani," she said. Her voice was high and thin, with nothing left of the woman who commanded a 2-star kitchen. "I poured salt into a pot of food. That's all. I'll compensate you. I'll write a confession. Tomas took one step toward her, and Addie moved between them. She didn't run. She didn't shout. She simply crossed the lobby in 3 steps and placed herself directly between Tomas and the woman who had destroyed her, facing Rafael Castellani from less than 2 paces away. "Don't." Tomas stopped. He didn't look at Addie. He looked at Rafe and waited. Rafe looked down at the woman in the white apron standing in his way, and no one had done that in 10 years. "Miss Vaughn, move aside." "No, sir. Do you understand what she did to my mother's dish?" "Yes," she said. "I understand it better than anyone in this room. I cooked that stew 12 times. I spent 4 nights discovering what was inside that jar, and this morning, I was the one who picked the empty jar up from the edge of the sink. She didn't take her eyes from him. I know what she did. And I'm still standing here." "Then move aside. If you do what you intend to do, Mr. Castellani, that dish is finished." Rafe said nothing. "Your sister is getting married in 3 days. She'll sit down, someone will lift the lid from the pot, and she'll smell her mother. What do you want inside your mind at that moment?" Addie lowered her voice, and in a lobby that silent, the quieter she spoke, the clearer every word became. "Every time she eats that dish for the rest of her life, you'll be sitting beside her, and you'll remember this afternoon. You won't remember your mother anymore. You'll remember this." Mrs. Whitfield raised one hand to her mouth. "Mrs." Hale stood behind Addie, leaning against the doorframe, and she didn't make a sound because she had no words left to speak. Rafael Castellani remained motionless for a very long time. He looked at Addie, then over her shoulder at the woman standing against the doorframe behind her, then back at Addie again. A car passed outside on the street. The refrigerator hummed from somewhere inside the kitchen. The silence lasted long enough for Mrs. Whitfield to steady herself against the back of a chair. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want you to go home, Mr. Castellani." He didn't answer. "And I want 3 days. 3 days for what?" "To cook it again. The wedding is the day after tomorrow, and no one has eaten that dish yet." Rafe looked at her for a while longer. Then he nodded. Once. Briefly. He turned away, adjusted the collar of his coat, and walked toward the door. Tomas pulled back the bolt and opened it for him, and before stepping outside, Rafe paused for 1 moment on the threshold. "Miss Vaughn." "Yes. This isn't me forgiving her." "Yes, sir. I know. You asked for it." Then he left. The door closed. A car engine started, drove away, and vanished toward the end of the street. "Mrs." Hale slid down the doorframe and collapsed onto the step leading into the dining room, both arms wrapped around her knees, and she began to tremble, the shaking moving from her shoulders downward, the kind of trembling that comes when someone finally understands what they have just narrowly escaped. No one helped her stand. Addie didn't look at her. She walked to the reception desk, picked up the small uncovered bowl, sealed it again with the old sheet of plastic wrap, and stood there holding it with her back to the entire lobby. Her shoulders shook once, and then they became still. "Mrs." Whitfield stepped up behind her. "Adeline." "Yes, ma'am. The wedding is at 12 o'clock noon the day after tomorrow. It's already after 5 o'clock in the afternoon." She looked up at the clock on the lobby wall. 72 hours. Don't sleep." "Yes, ma'am. How many people do you need?" 3, ma'am. Marisol and 2 others. And I need burner number 2 from now until the end of the day after tomorrow. No one touches it. Done. Mrs. Whitfield walked past Mrs. Hale, who was still sitting on the step. Without stopping or saying a single word to her, she crossed to the center of the lobby, turned around, and spoke her final sentence in the voice of the 3rd-generation owner of that restaurant, not the voice of the woman who had been crying 10 minutes earlier. "And from this moment forward, you are the head chef of this restaurant." At 6 o'clock that evening, Addie stood at burner number 2 with 3 people, Marisol and the 2 youngest cooks on the evening shift, and the first thing she did was peel 20 oranges. She didn't dry the peels in the oven. She spread them across a dry pan, watched every batch, and turned off the heat 1 moment later than she should have. Her hands were trembling, and she ruined the first 3 batches. The 4th was right. Marisol stood beside her and watched, and by the 6th batch, the girl could do it herself. So Addie let her. The stew began cooking at 9 o'clock that night. Throughout the next 2 days, burner number 2 remained lit without interruption, and the 4 of them took turns sleeping on 2 folding chairs set up in the changing room. Mrs. Whitfield never came down into the kitchen. Each morning, she only stood at the top of the stairs, looked over everything once, then went back upstairs. Mrs. Hale didn't come to the restaurant. At 11 o'clock on the morning of the 41st day, the back door opened. Josie Castellani stood there alone, wearing a long coat and carrying a small cloth bag. "My brother asked me to bring this to you." She held out the bag. Inside was the wooden spoon with the broken handle. "He said you left it on the edge of the table that day, and he told me to repeat these exact words to you. If you're cooking in her pot, then you should stir it with her spoon." Addie wiped her hands on her apron before accepting it. "Thank you. May I sit here for a while? There have been 40 people in my house since this morning, and I just want to sit somewhere where no one asks me about flowers." "Please sit." Josie pulled out the plastic chair from the corner of the kitchen, sat down, and remained there for a long time, silently watching the cast-iron pot on burner number 2. "Miss Vaughn." "Yes. What did you say to my brother that day?" "In the lobby, after I left. I asked him to go home." "And he really went home?" "Yes." Josie nodded slowly. "My brother never goes home when someone has done something to our family." She didn't say it with pride. She said it the way someone might describe the weather where they lived. "But he went home." Then she stood, walked over to the stove, and looked into the pot. "Will you teach me how to stir it?" Addie picked up the wooden spoon. "I can only stir with one hand, miss." She said it plainly, without trying to hide anything, and held out her left hand so Josie could see the little finger that wouldn't straighten. "This hand can hold the edge of the pot, that's all." Josie looked at the hand. She didn't ask a question. "Then I'll be the other hand," she said. She stepped to Addie's left, placed her hand higher on the spoon's handle where the wood had been worn smooth, and Addie held the lower part. Together, they stirred once around the pot, then a second time, slowly, evenly, and neither of them spoke during those circles. Marisol stood at the cutting table behind them, stopped her knife, and said nothing either. Josie stayed for exactly 20 minutes. Before leaving, she paused at the back door. 12 o'clock tomorrow. You'll be there, won't you?" "I'm going with the supply truck, miss. I have to watch the pot." "No, I'm asking whether you'll be there." Addie paused for one moment. "I'll be there." On the 42nd day, at 12 o'clock noon, the wedding began in a rented hall on the north side of the city, with 260 guests, and at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the main course was served. There were no porcelain plates. 260 small cast-iron pots rested on wooden stands with their lids still closed, and the servers had been instructed to wait for the signal before opening them all at once. Mrs. Whitfield stood at the far end of the room, and she was the one who raised her hand. 260 lids lifted in the same moment, and the entire hall fell silent. It wasn't the polite silence people offered at a wedding reception. It was the silence of 260 people smelling the same thing and stopping halfway through whatever they had been saying. The uncle over 70 sat at the front table, lowered his cane, leaned forward, and didn't eat immediately. He remained that way for a long time. 3 tables behind him, an elderly woman lifted her napkin to her eyes. Josie ate 3 spoonfuls, then set down her spoon, stood, and walked toward the band. She took the microphone. "May I have 1 minute, please?" The entire room turned toward her. "My mother died 13 years ago. For 13 years, every year on the anniversary of her death, my brother and I have tried to make this dish again. And every year, we failed. My brother carried our mother's pot to 5 restaurants. The first 4 all said they could do it. None of them could." She paused and drew a breath. "Today, someone did." She looked toward the far end of the hall. The woman who cooked this dish wasn't the head chef of that restaurant. 3 weeks ago, she was still working the night shift, washing dishes and scrubbing floors in that kitchen. And 3 weeks ago, no one in that restaurant could even remember her name. She paused longer this time. "Her name is Adeline Vaughn. She didn't recreate my mother's food. She brought my mother back to sit at this table." Everyone in the hall turned toward the far end of the room. Addie stood in the corner beside the door leading to the temporary kitchen, wearing her own old apron, the one with oil stains along the hem, because she had returned the white apron she'd taken from the second floor that day and had never taken it out again. She stood straight, with both hands behind her back, her left hand hidden inside her right. The person seated at the table nearest the door stood first. Then the next 2 tables. Then the entire hall rose, 260 people, and the applause continued for so long that Addie didn't know where to look. At the family table, Raphael Castellani stood with everyone else. He didn't applaud. He simply stood, facing her, then lowered his head in one brief bow, the kind of bow no one in that city had seen him give to another person in 10 years. At 9 o'clock the following morning, Mrs. Whitfield called Mrs. Hale upstairs to the office, and she didn't close the door. "Leave your key card, locker key, and the cold storage access code on my desk. Your contract ends today. I'll pay this month's salary in full. I won't withhold a single dollar, and I won't write a single line in your professional record." She pushed a sheet of paper across the desk. "Sign here." Mrs. Hale signed. She didn't argue. She placed the key card on the desk, then the key, then a small piece of paper with 6 handwritten numbers, and she didn't speak once during the 10 minutes she spent upstairs. She went down to the kitchen to collect her knives. The entire kitchen fell silent as she passed, and it was the first time in 22 years that the kitchen had gone quiet for a different reason. Addie was at the center cooking station with her sleeves rolled up, standing over the morning pot of stock. She looked up and watched Mrs. Hale walk toward the back door with the knife case beneath her arm. Addie wiped her hands and followed. Mrs. Hale had already reached the alley. She stopped when she heard the door open. "Why did you come out here?" "There's something I want to ask you, Mrs. Hale. You don't have to answer. I'll go back inside if you don't want to." Mrs. Hale looked at her. The morning light in the alley fell directly across her face, and beneath it, she appeared much older than the woman who had stood at the head of the steel table 3 weeks earlier. "Ask. For 2 years you haven't raised a spoon to your mouth even once." Mrs. Hale didn't answer immediately. She placed the knife case on the step, then straightened. 2 years ago, I underwent treatment for 6 months, she said. Chemotherapy. My hair grew back, so no one can see anything when they look at me. But one thing never came back. She raised a hand and touched her chin. I can still detect salt a little, very faintly. Sweetness is almost completely gone. Bitter, sour, everything in between, gone. I sit down to eat with my family, and I don't know what food is on the table. Addie stood motionless. Do you understand what that means to someone in this profession? The day I left the hospital, I went home and made a pot of stock. I tasted it, and I couldn't tell what it was like. I poured it away. I made a second pot. It was the same. She gave one brief laugh that held nothing at all. Then I bought a digital scale. I wrote down every recipe I'd cooked in 22 years, every single gram, and I began cooking by numbers. 3 grams for the morning pot, 7 grams when water was added. I lifted the spoon, examined the color, tilted it to watch the liquid run, and judge the thickness. I did everything a head chef was supposed to do, and then I handed the spoon to a 20-year-old boy and asked him whether it was right. 2 years. No one knew. Why didn't you tell Mrs. Whitfield? For what? So she could send me into early retirement with a cake and a card? Mrs. Hale looked toward the mouth of the alley. Then you came. Addie said nothing. A dishwasher. You stood at that sink for 3 years, and I never noticed you once. Not until that day in April, when you were scrubbing trays at the far end of the kitchen and told one of the young cooks that the stock needed salt. You said it from the other side of the kitchen. You didn't taste it. You didn't come near it. You smelled it. She turned back toward Addie. That day, I'd weighed exactly 3 grams according to my notebook. And you were right. The stock needed salt because the boy had added more water without telling me. She picked up the knife case. I didn't hate you, Adeline. I was afraid of you. I was afraid of you every day for the past 3 weeks, and I did what frightened people do. She took 2 steps. Mrs. Hale. She stopped. Addie stood on the back step with her hands still wet, and she remained silent for a long time before speaking. She thought about that afternoon in the lobby, about the small bowl she'd held against her chest as she ran out, about the $8,400 that had rested on the table in her rented room through an entire sleepless night. My mother told me something when I was still too small to reach the stove. She said that when you hold on to anger, the only person who gets burned is the one holding it. She held out both hands, her right hand and her left, the scar running toward the little finger. My hands don't have room to hold anything else. Then she turned, went back inside, and walked directly upstairs. Mrs. Whitfield was standing at the office window, and she had seen everything. Ma'am, I'm asking you to keep her. Mrs. Whitfield spun around. What did you say? Not as head chef. She can't season food anymore. That's the truth, and I won't allow her to take responsibility for a single pot in this restaurant. Addie stood in the center of the office with both hands resting before her apron. But she has 22 years of knowledge. She knows why a sauce begins to separate before it actually does. She knows how many hours someone can stand at a stove before their back gives out, and how to arrange a kitchen so 14 people can work without stepping over one another. None of that lives on the tongue. She spoke the final sentence more slowly. Her sense of taste is gone, ma'am, but the 22 years inside her mind are still there. Mrs. Whitfield looked at her for a very long time. Then she walked to the window, opened it, and called down into the alley, "Priscilla, come upstairs." 6 weeks later, the small private dining room was converted into a classroom on Saturday mornings. 12 young people, between 16 and 18 years old, all recently graduated from high school, attended without paying a single dollar in tuition. During the first lesson, they burned a batch of onions, and the entire class laughed so loudly that Mrs. Whitfield had to come downstairs to see what had happened. Priscilla Hale taught the theory lessons. She held a spoon, filled it with stock, and handed it to a boy who was studying the recipe taped to the board. Then she repeated the exact words Addie had spoken to her in the alley that morning. "Close your eyes. Don't look at the recipe. Smell it first." The boy closed his eyes, smelled the stock, and said, "I think it's a little bland, ma'am." And Priscilla Hale laughed. Everyone in the room turned to look at her, because no one in that restaurant had ever heard that sound before. That Thursday, Addie went to the nursing center as she always did, and the nurse on duty on the 3rd floor called her back the moment she stepped into the hallway, in exactly the same way she had called her over on the day she handed her the letter. "Miss Vaughn, I have something for you." This time, she didn't offer an envelope. She handed Addie a receipt printed by the financial office, stating that the entire overdue balance for patient Owen Vaughn had been paid in full, along with all treatment and care expenses for the next 3 years, fully covered. Someone paid by bank transfer on Monday morning. They didn't leave a name. Accounting said they made only one request, that we give you this note. Addie unfolded it. A small piece of paper, handwritten, 4 words. "You aren't finished yet." She stood in the hallway for a very long time with the note in her hand. Then she took out her phone, opened the photograph of the ink-blurred recipe page she had saved during the 2nd week, enlarged it, and held the screen beside the note. The handwriting leaned to the right. The letter O was left open at the top. The crossbar of the letter T extended beyond the stem. The same hand. That afternoon, she went to the construction company's office on the north side of the city, and they allowed her inside immediately without asking a single question, as though instructions had already been given. Raphael Castellani rose from behind his desk when she entered. "Miss Vaughn." She placed the note on the desk. Then she set her phone beside it, the screen still displaying the photograph of the recipe page. "Your mother didn't write this page." Rafe looked down at the 2 items. "No. Who did?" "I did." He pulled out his chair and sat down, and he concealed nothing. "I was 21 years old, 3 days after she died. That night, I went into the kitchen at home, sat on the floor beside the stove, and tried to remember. I knew that if I didn't remember it that night, I would lose it. I sat there from evening until almost dawn, and I managed to write down 14 things. Addie looked at him. "You missed one." "I know," he said. "I've known for 13 years. The first restaurant made something delicious, and I knew something was missing. The second did the same. By the 4th, the chef told me there was nothing missing, sir. You simply remember it incorrectly. Everyone misremembers the food they ate as a child." And I almost believed him. He pushed the image on the phone screen back toward her. "I just didn't know what it was. I knew it was there. I could smell it in my mind for 13 years, but I couldn't give it a name." Addie sat in the chair across from him. "It was in the jar, sir. Your mother didn't write it down because to her, it wasn't a spice. It was a batch of orange peel she'd burned and couldn't bear to throw away. And you found it in 4 nights. I found it because I was the only person in that kitchen who was ordered to carry the box out to the trash." Rafe was silent for a while. Then he spoke. "Miss Vaughn." "Yes. That money wasn't payment for your work. Mrs. Whitfield has already paid you for the work." "Then what was it for, sir? So you won't leave?" He looked directly at her, and his voice remained as quiet as always. "Stay in Chicago." Addie sat without moving. She thought about the rented room above the laundromat, the 2 bus rides, The 3 years and 2 months spent standing at a sink where no one had ever asked her name. I didn't have anywhere else to go anyway, Mr. Castellani. Rafe. She looked up. Rafe. 6 months later, the old sign was taken down on a Tuesday morning. Mrs. Whitfield stood on the sidewalk watching the workers fasten the new one into place, and she remained there until they were finished. The sign carried 2 names, Whitfield and Vaughn. My family has carried this name for 3 generations, she said. My grandfather opened this restaurant in 1938. But the person who kept this profession alive wasn't a member of my family. She turned toward Addie. Whatever you want to change in this restaurant first, say it. You have that authority now. Addie looked at the sign for a while, then made the only request she wanted to make. On the shift schedule, ma'am, the night dishwasher should have a full name like everyone else. Don't write night shift anymore. Write the person's name. That night, when the kitchen was empty and only 2 lights remained on above the center cooking station, Addie placed the cast iron pot on burner number 2 and prepared a small batch for herself. She used exactly the 14 ingredients written on the page. Then, at the end, she took the handful of orange peel she had scorched earlier in a dry pan, its edges blackened and carrying a faintly burned fragrance, and dropped it into the pot. She didn't try to make it smell better. She pulled out the plastic chair, sat beside the stove with the broken wooden spoon in her hand. And in that dark kitchen, she remembered the words her mother had spoken when Addie was still too small to reach the stovetop. The same words she would one day repeat to the children sitting in the Saturday morning class. Never cook with only your hands. Cook with the memories of the person who once stood there. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that every day we may continue discovering more stories worth hearing together. How do you feel about Adeline's story? About the forgiveness she offered to the person who once harmed her? And about the quiet people who work every day while hardly anyone remembers their names? Please leave a comment. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May you and your family always be blessed with abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.